If you lead training in a regulated organization, you have probably inherited a training program that looks compliant on paper. Every employee has a training record, every SOP has a sign-off date. But when an auditor asks the question that matters, how did you determine what training your people actually need? That is where the silence begins. The root cause is almost always the same. No defensible training needs analysis. Today, we will walk through the 6-step process for building a TNA that holds up under scrutiny and the 4 mistakes that get quality organizations cited. A training needs analysis is a documented, defensible process that connects organizational requirements to specific training interventions. It is the bridge between what your quality system demands and what your people can actually demonstrate. Most organizations confuse a TNA with a training wish list. A department manager says, "My team needs root cause analysis training," and it goes straight into the LMS. That is order taking, and order taking does not hold up in an audit. ISO 9001:2015 Clause 7.2 requires your organization to determine the competence necessary for personnel whose work affects quality. ICHQ 10 expects a structured approach to performance monitoring. Neither standard uses the phrase training needs analysis, but both demand the evidence that only a TNA can produce. Here is where the gap actually lives. Most regulated organizations have a training process. They can show you the training records. What they cannot show you is the defensible method they used to decide what training went into those records in the first place. There are 6 steps to a defensible TNA. Let's start with the first one. Step 1. Define the trigger. A TNA should fire on a specific event, a performance gap, a new piece of equipment, a regulatory change, a CAPA outcome that points to a competency issue. It should not fire because the annual training calendar rolled over. FDA 483 observations and warning letters frequently cite training deficiencies. In practice, these citations often trace back to training that was poorly scoped. The underlying competency gap was never clearly identified before the training was designed. Step 2. Observe before you assess. Before you dedicate resources to training, determine whether the problem is actually a training problem. A recurring deviation in environmental monitoring could be a competency gap. It could also be a procedure design failure, or an equipment limitation, or a hiring mismatch. If you apply training to a non-training problem, nothing changes, except now you have documented that you trained people, and the deviation keeps occurring. That makes your position worse. The TNA is your gate. Observation confirms direction before resources are committed. Step 3. Select the analysis type. Most regulated companies default to the individual level. Performance reviews, competency checklists, person-by-person gap analysis, that matters. But if that is the only lens you use, you miss something larger. An organizational level TNA asks, does the entire quality unit understand what the QMSR requires under 21 CFR Part 820? A task-level TNA asks, can every analyst running this dissolution method produce consistent results? An individual-level TNA asks, does this specific operator need remedial training after that deviation? ISO 13485 Clause 6.2 requires competence at every level. If your TNA only looks at individual performance reviews, you are missing the organizational and task layers entirely, and so are your auditors when they work upward from findings to system-level causes. Step 4. Collect data that holds up. Assessments, observations, interviews, performance metrics, all of it documented, because the data source is the audit trail. 21 CFR Part 11 applies to training records. If your TNA data lives in spreadsheets and email threads, it is not defensible, regardless of how thorough your analysis was. Now, here is where most organizations fall short. Step 5. Link competency to goals. Every identified gap must map to a specific, measurable training objective. Improve cleanroom behavior is a wish. Reduce aseptic technique deviations by 40% within 2 quarters is a training objective. The gap defines the goal. The goal defines the intervention. The The intervention defines the assessment. Break that chain at any point and you lose audit defensibility. Step 6. Decide delivery method and effectiveness criteria. Blended learning, e-learning, classroom instruction, structured on-the-job training. The method follows the need, and every delivery selection carries defined effectiveness criteria from the start. A TNA that concludes everyone needs a 1-hour computer-based module regardless of the gap type is a procurement decision wearing a TNA label. And this is the point worth pausing on. Think of a TNA like an investigation report. If an auditor asks why you trained 12 operators on sterility assurance, your answer must present the documented gap, the data that confirmed it, the training designed to close it, and the evidence that it worked. That is the difference between a training activity and a defensible position. And this is the gap most often overlooked. You cannot separate a training needs analysis from your training documentation system. The TNA produces the evidence that training was required. The LMS documents that training was delivered. The EQMS closes the loop with effectiveness checks and CAPA integration. Without those three connected, you have silos. And unintegrated systems make those gaps obvious during an audit. Quality organizations do not get audited on effort, they get audited on evidence. 4 mistakes that generate audit findings. First, the calendar-driven TNA. Conducted annually because the SOP says so, regardless of whether anything actually changed in your operations, your equipment, or your regulatory environment. This generates training that adds no value. It also trains auditors to expect a TNA that exists only to satisfy a calendar requirement. When they find it, they look deeper. Second, the copy-paste TNA. Same needs assessment every year with updated dates in the footer and the same gap descriptions. Auditors check version history, they check metadata. A copy-paste TNA is a signal that the organization treats training as a paperwork exercise. Third, the manager-only input. TNA data comes exclusively from department heads, never from operators, never from actual performance metrics, never cross-referenced with deviation trends. The result is a needs assessment that reflects what leadership believes the gaps are, rather than what is actually happening on the floor. That disconnect between perception and operational reality is exactly the kind of gap an FDA inspection is designed to surface. Fourth, the disconnected TNA. The analysis lives in a shared drive. Training records live in the LMS. CAPA outcomes live in the EQMS. 3 systems, 0 integration, no closed loop. When the auditor asks you to trace a single training decision from identified need to documented effectiveness, you cannot do it. The evidence is scattered across systems that do not talk to each other, even though the work itself got done. eLeaP was built to close exactly this gap, an EQMS platform with enterprise LMS integrated at the architecture level. Your CAPA-triggered training, document control gating, competency records, and audit evidence live in one system purpose-built for regulated industries. A defensible training needs analysis is the foundation of every audit-ready training program. If you want to see how eLeaP connects TNA to training delivery to audit evidence, the link is in the description. And let me know in the comments. What triggers a TNA in your organization? A calendar date, a CAPA, or something else entirely?